It was a sanctuary of jasmine and manicured lawns, a place where dignity was purchased with a checkbook. But the couple standing in my lobby weren't there to buy peace. They were there to beg for it. I'm Alyssa Sanders, and as I watched them clutch a brochure for the facility I built, I didn't see customers. I saw the parents who left me on a peeling porch 12 years ago, calling me heavy baggage before driving away into their selfish freedom. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. Now, let me tell you how I decided their fate. Silver Creek Manor did not smell like old age. It did not smell of decline or medicine or the dusty finality of a waiting room. It smelled of jasmine, fresh-cut St. Augustine grass, and the crisp, expensive scent of lemon polish. I made sure of that. From my office, on the second floor, the glass wall offered me a panoramic view of the kingdom I had built. Below the gardens were a geometric masterpiece of color. A gardener was currently deadheading the roses near the koi pond, his movements rhythmic and precise. To the left, Mrs. Albright was taking her afternoon tea on the terrace, a cashmere shawl draped over her shoulders, looking for all the world like a dowager queen rather than a widow with advanced osteoporosis. I adjusted the cuff of my blazer, smoothing a microscopic wrinkle. My reflection in the glass showed a woman who matched the surroundings, severe, polished, and composed. At 29, I was the executive director and sole owner of the most exclusive retirement sanctuary in the state. I wasn't just an administrator, I was the architect of dignity. Director Sanders. I didn't turn around. I knew it was my assistant Clara standing in the doorway. She was likely holding the weekly budget report, terrified that I would find a misplaced decimal point. Leave it on the desk, Clara. And please tell maintenance that the fountain in the east courtyard is splashing onto the walkway. It's a slipping hazard. Yes, ma'am. Immediately, the door clicked shut. Silence returned, heavy and comforting. This was my life. I had staff who feared my attention to detail and residents who adored the safety I provided. I had a bank account that could swallow my childhood whole. But when the sun went down and I drove my immaculate sedan to my downtown apartment, the silence followed me. I would eat dinner standing over the sink, staring at the lights of the city, surrounded by furniture that no one else ever sat on. I had built a fortress of order to keep the chaos of the world at bay. I tolerated no mistakes, no messes, and no surprises. Chaos was dangerous. Chaos was a humid afternoon in Florida, watching the people who were supposed to love you drive away. Outside, the sky suddenly bruised purple. A summer storm was rolling in, heavy and fast. The first crack of thunder rattled the heavy window pane, and just like that, the smell of lemon polish vanished. Suddenly, I could smell wet asphalt and rotting citrus. The memory didn't ask for permission to enter. It simply kicked the door down. It was 12 years ago. The heat in Tampa was physical, a wet blanket that clung to your skin and made it hard to breathe. I was 17, standing on the peeling gray porch of Great Aunt Linda's house. I barely knew the woman. She was a distant relative who smelled of mothballs and disapproval, currently watching us from behind her screen door. My father, Robert, was trying to fit a set of golf clubs into the trunk of his convertible. The car was cherry red, shining violently under the sun. It was new. It's a tight fit, he laughed, wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked vibrant. His polo shirt was crisp. His tan was golden. He didn't look like a father dropping off his child. He looked like a man leaving a burden at the roadside dump. My mother, Elaine, was already in the passenger seat adjusting her sunglasses. She wouldn't look at me. She was fiddling with the radio dial, humming along to a song I couldn't hear. Dad, my voice sounded small, pathetic, even to my own ears. How long are you going to be gone? Robert slammed the trunk. He turned to me, putting on that dazzling salesman smile that had charmed neighbors and creditors alike for years. Alyssa, honey, we've been over this, he said, his tone breezy as if discussing a weekend trip to the grocery store. Your mother and I, we've given up everything for you. 18 years of sacrifice. It's our turn now. But why here? I gestured to the rundown house. I have school. I have friends. You're old enough to handle this, he said, checking his watch. A Rolex, or at least it looked like one. We need to find ourselves, Alyssa. We need to breathe. And frankly, right now, you're just baggage. The word hung in the humid air. Baggage. Heavy, clunky, unwanted. Baggage, I whispered. Don't make a scene, Alyssa. It's unbecoming. Elaine called out from the car, her voice sharp. We'll send a postcard from Nice. Robert hopped into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, a sound of pure, selfish freedom. Be good for Linda, he shouted over the engine. They didn't hug me. They didn't hand me cash for emergencies. They didn't even look back as they pulled out of the gravel driveway. I watched the red convertible turn the corner, the taillights flashing once before disappearing. I stood there for an hour. The thunder began to roll then too. The rain came down, soaking my clothes, plastering my hair to my face. I felt a physical hollowing out of my chest, a sensation so acute I thought my heart had actually stopped beating. It wasn't just sadness. It was the absolute crushing realization that I was entirely alone in the world. I was disposable. Bzzzt. The intercom on my desk shrieked, snapping the memory in half. I gasped, my hand flying to my chest. The Florida humidity vanished, replaced by the climate-controlled chill of my office. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling. I pressed the button. Yes, my voice was ragged. I cleared my throat and tried again, sharper this time. Yes, Clara. I asked not to be disturbed. I'm so sorry, Ms. Sanders. Clara's voice was tinny and anxious. I know you're busy, but we have a situation in the lobby. I don't handle walk-ins, Clara. You know the protocol. Refer them to Mr. Henderson. I tried, ma'am, but they're refusing to leave. They say it's an emergency. They look distressed. I pinched the bridge of my nose, squeezing my eyes shut to banish the lingering image of the red convertible. Security can escort them out if they are causing a scene. I don't think they're dangerous, Ms. Sanders, just desperate. I sighed, swiveling my chair toward the bank of security monitors on the wall. Fine, let me see. I pulled up the feed for the main lobby. The camera offered a high-angle black and white view of the reception area. The pristine marble floors shone under the chandelier. Standing near the front desk were two figures. I froze. The air in the room seemed to vanish. The man was leaning heavily on the counter. He was wearing a suit that might have been expensive 10 years ago, but now it hung loosely on his frame, the shoulders slumped. His hair, once a thick, arrogant gold, was wispy and white. The woman stood beside him, clutching a purse with both hands, her knuckles white. She looked frail. Her posture curved inward as if trying to make herself smaller. They looked old. They looked diminished. They looked broken. But I knew them. I knew the tilt of the man's chin. I knew the nervous way the woman smoothed the front of her coat. It was Robert and Elaine. My parents were standing in the lobby of Silver Creek Manor. They were clutching one of my glossy brochures like a lifeline, staring around at the luxury I had created, completely unaware that the daughter they had discarded like baggage was the one sitting on the throne. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. The blue room was designed for difficult conversations. It was the smallest of our intake suites, painted a calming, oceanic slate furnished with plush armchairs that were impossible to perch on aggressively. You had to sink into them. It was a room designed to make people feel small, safe, and pliable. But its most important feature was the mirror on the north wall. To the occupants, it was a tasteful piece of decor, reflecting the manicured peace of the room. To me, standing in the darkened observation closet on the other side, it was a window into the soul of my prospective clients. "Mr. Henderson is going in now," Clara whispered through the headset. I didn't answer. I stood in the dark, arms crossed over my chest, watching the two ghosts sitting in my armchairs. Robert and Elaine Sanders looked like a bad photocopy of the parents I remembered. The vibrant colors were gone. Robert's skin, once a deep sailing tan bronze, was now the color of old parchment spotted with age. He sat with his legs crossed, one hand draped over the armrest in a pose of casual affluence, but his fingers were drumming a frantic, silent rhythm against the upholstery. Elaine was worse. She sat rigid, her knees pressed together, clutching a handbag that had been stylish in the late 90s. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on the crown, molding the vase of fresh lilies, the heavy oak door everywhere except the mirror where I stood. The door to the blue room opened, and David Henderson, my sales director, walked in. David was a good man, soft-spoken, patient, and utterly ruthless when it came to closing a contract. He didn't know who these people were. To him, they were just another couple trying to buy their way into paradise. "Good afternoon," David said, his voice filtering clearly through the observation speakers. "I'm Mr. Henderson. Welcome to Silver Creek." "Charmed," Robert said. His voice was rougher than I remembered, like gravel grinding in a mixer, but the affectation was the same. He leaned forward, extending a hand. "Robert Sanders, this is my wife, Elaine. We've heard wonderful things about your establishment. Truly top tier." "We try our best," David said, sitting opposite them and opening a file. "I understand you're looking for immediate placement." "Well, we're flexible," Robert lied. I could see the sweat beading at his hairline. "We've just returned from quite a long stint abroad. We've been living in Europe for the last decade. Nice, mostly. A little time in the Tuscan hills. You know how it is, the maintenance on a villa becomes a bore after a while." I felt a cold sneer curl my lip in the darkness. Nice. Tuscany. It was exactly what they had told me on the porch 12 years ago. They had gone to live the dream. "Europe is lovely," David said politely. "But moving back stateside can be a logistical challenge. Do you have your financial portfolio prepared? Silver Creek is a private equity buy-in community. We require a thorough vetting of assets." Of course, of course." Robert waved his hand dismissively. As he moved, his sleeve rode up. I pressed my face closer to the glass. On his wrist sat a gold watch. From a distance, it looked like a Patek Philippe. But under the harsh halogen lights of the blue room, I saw the truth. The gold plating was rubbing off the clasp, revealing dull gray steel underneath. The face was slightly clouded. It was a fake, a prop, just like the confidence he was projecting. "Our assets are somewhat complex at the moment," Robert continued, his smile never wavering. "Mostly tied up in overseas bonds, very high yield but illiquid. We were hoping to discuss a transitional arrangement." David didn't blink. "I'm afraid I don't understand, Mr. Sanders." "A payment plan," Robert said. The jovial tone cracked just for a millisecond, revealing a jagged edge of panic underneath. "Just until the bonds mature. A monthly stipend, perhaps. We can pay a premium for the convenience." David closed the file. The sound was soft, but in the silence of the room it sounded like a gavel striking a block. "Mr. Sanders, Silver Creek does not offer financing. We are not a nursing home. We are a luxury estate. The buy-in for our smallest cottage is $300,000 paid up front, plus a monthly maintenance fee of $6,000. The silence that followed was absolute. I watched Elaine. She hadn't spoken a word. Upon hearing the number, she didn't gasp. She simply closed her eyes. It was a look of total defeat, the look of a woman who had been swimming upstream for hours and had finally swallowed water. 300, Robert repeated. He let out a breathless, hollow laugh. That's quite a figure. It is the standard for the level of care and security we provide, David said. If that is outside your budget, I can recommend several state-subsidized facilities in the county. No, the word ripped out of Elaine. It was the first time she had spoken. Her eyes snapped open wide and wet with terror. She grabbed Robert's arm, her fingers digging into his suit jacket. "We can't go back there, Bob," she whispered. The microphone picked up the tremor in her voice. "Please, not back there. It's not safe." Robert patted her hand, but his own was shaking. Now, Lainey, don't get upset. It's just a negotiation." I frowned. Back there. Back where? To a smaller apartment, to a less prestigious gated community. Her fear seemed disproportionate to the situation. It was the fear of a child afraid of the dark, not a woman afraid of a budget motel. But then I looked at Robert's face, the calculation, the shifting eyes, and my sympathy evaporated. He was trying to figure out which lie to tell next. He was trying to con my staff just as he had conned me into believing I was loved until the moment it became inconvenient. "Mr. Henderson," I said into my headset. "Step out. I'll take it from here." David looked up at the camera, subtly nodded, and stood. "Excuse me for a moment. I need to consult with the director." He left the room. Robert slumped back in his chair, exhaling a long, ragged breath. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his face. "Pull it together, Bob," he muttered to himself. "We just need time. I can talk them into it." "They're going to send us away," Elaine whimpered. "They aren't going to send us away. I'm Robert Sanders. I always find a way." I turned away from the glass. My heart was pounding a war drum against my ribs, but my hands were steady. I walked to the mirror in the small hallway, checking my appearance. Not a hair out of place. The severe navy suit was armor. The diamond studs in my ears were real, bought with money I earned, not stolen from a child's future. I was ready. I opened the door to the blue room and stepped inside. The air in the room was thick with the smell of stale anxiety and cheap cologne, a scent I suddenly remembered from my childhood. It was the smell of my father trying too hard. "Mr. and Mrs. Sanders," I said. My voice was cool, stripped of any local accent polished to a professional shine. Robert jumped to his feet. "Yes, that's us. And you are—" "I am the executive director," I said, walking past him to the desk. I didn't offer my hand. I sat down in the leather chair David had vacated, placing my palms flat on the mahogany surface. "My name is Ms. Sanders." I waited. I waited for the spark of recognition. I waited for him to squint, to tilt his head to see the eyes that were the exact same shade as his own. I waited for Elaine to recognize the curvature of my jaw, which I had inherited from her mother. Robert smiled, a greased, desperate thing. "Sanders. Well, isn't that a coincidence? We must be distant cousins. Perhaps that earns us the family discount." He laughed. He actually laughed. He didn't know me. I looked at Elaine. She was staring at my suit, seemingly mesmerized by the fabric. She looked up at my face, her eyes glazing over. Nothing. To them, I was just a bureaucrat in a blazer. I was an obstacle, not a daughter. The realization hit me. with the force of a physical blow followed immediately by a surge of cold, clarifying rage. I had spent 12 years agonizing over them, hating them, missing them, and they had forgotten me so completely that I could sit 3 feet away and be a stranger. There are no discounts at Silver Creek, I said. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mr. Henderson briefed me on your situation. I reviewed your application myself. It's just a momentary liquidity issue. Robert began launching into his rehearsed speech. As I was telling your associate, the European markets are— Stop, I said. The word was soft, but it snapped like a whip. Robert's mouth clicked shut. I am not interested in fairy tales about European markets, Mr. Sanders. I run a business. This facility has a wait list of 50 people. Families who have the funds ready in cash. Families who plan ahead. I opened the folder, though I didn't need to look at it. You claim to have spent the last decade traveling, I said, locking eyes with him. Nice. Tuscany. The Algarve. You lived the high life. You indulged every whim. You spent your prime years drinking wine and sleeping in silk sheets. Robert straightened his tie, looking offended. We have lived a cultured life, yes. Is that a crime? It is when you fail to prepare for the bill, I said. You spent everything. You emptied the coffers on your own pleasure, assuming that the future would just take care of itself. Or perhaps you thought someone else would pick up the tab when you were done having fun. Elaine flinched. It wasn't like that. Wasn't it? I leaned forward. You have no portfolio. The credit check Mr. Henderson ran shows multiple closed accounts. You are destitute, Mr. Sanders. You are wearing a knockoff watch and trying to lease a cottage that costs more than you have likely seen in 5 years. Robert's face went red, then patchy white. The bluster began to dissolve, revealing the terrified old man beneath. You have no right to speak to me that way. We are people of dignity. Dignity is purchased, I said cruelly. In this world, dignity costs $300,000. I pulled a contract from the file. I slid it across the desk. It landed in front of them with a heavy slap. This is the agreement for Cottage 4. It is the last unit available this quarter. Robert looked at the paper, then at me. Hope flickered in his eyes, pathetic, blinding hope. You're offering it to us with the payment plan. No, I said. I am offering you a deadline. I tapped the face of my watch, my real Swiss-made watch. It is currently 2:00 p.m. I require a wire transfer for the full amount, $300,000 by 5:00 p.m. today. If the funds are not in our account by the close of business, the cottage goes to the next name on the list and security will escort you off the premises. 5 o'clock, Robert sputtered. That's impossible. Even if I could liquidate the bonds, it takes days. Then I suggest you make some phone calls, I said, standing up. You must have friends, associates from your travels. Surely a man who has lived such a rich life has people who would be willing to help him. I knew he didn't. I knew he had burned every bridge he ever crossed. I was counting on it. Please, Elaine whispered. She wasn't looking at the contract. She was looking at the door as if she expected something terrible to walk through it. We have nowhere else to go. You don't understand. We can't be out there alone. That sounds like a personal problem, I said, my voice as unyielding as the glass walls of my office. You made your choices. You chose your life. Now you have to pay for it. I turned my back on them and walked to the door. 5:00 p.m., Mr. Sanders. Don't be late. I walked out, closing the door on their whispers. I marched down the hall, my heels clicking a sharp, victorious rhythm. I had them. I had cornered them exactly where I wanted them. They were going to feel the same panic, the same hopelessness, the same absolute abandonment that I had felt on that porch. I reached my office and shut the door, leaning back against it, breathing hard. I felt powerful. I felt vindicated. So, why did I feel like I wanted to vomit? The silence in the room was not the peaceful kind I sold in my brochures. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a guillotine blade waiting to drop. Robert stared at the door I had just walked through, then back at the contract on the desk. He looked like a man trying to read a map in a language he didn't speak. He reached for the paper, his hand trembling so violently that the page rattled against the mahogany surface. I stood by the door, hand on the brass knob, watching. I should have left. I had delivered the ultimatum, but I couldn't move. A dark gravity held me there. I needed to see it happen. I needed to see the moment the illusion finally shattered. 5 o'clock, Robert muttered, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket to wipe his streaming forehead. I can make some calls. I still have contacts in London. Perhaps Edwards know he passed away. The trust know. He was spiraling. He was listing names of people he hadn't spoken to in 20 years, people who likely wouldn't spit on him if he were on fire. Bob, Elaine whispered. She hadn't moved. She was still staring at the carpet, her body curled inward like a dying leaf. Bob, stop it. We just need a bridge loan, Robert said, his voice rising in pitch, manic and desperate. Just a few days. Once I get the bonds sorted. There are no bonds, Elaine shrieked. The sound tore through the room. It was a raw, jagged noise that didn't belong in Silver Creek Manor. Robert froze. He looked at his wife with a mixture of shock and betrayal. Elaine, please, not in front of... There are no bonds, she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. There is no money, Bob. Stop lying. Please, for the love of God, just stop lying. I took a step back toward the desk. The professional distance I had maintained was beginning to evaporate. The heat of my own anger was rising, burning through the cool exterior of the director. Your wife seems to have a grasp on reality that you lack, Mr. Sanders, I said, my voice dripping with disdain. Robert snapped his head toward me. His eyes were red-rimmed, wild. The humiliation was finally setting in, curdling into aggression. This is a private matter. You have no right to stand there and judge us. We are customers. We deserve respect. Respect is earned, I shot back, and solvency is proven. You have neither. We are leaving, Robert announced, though he made no move to stand up. He drew himself up, trying to summon the ghost of the arrogance he used to wear like a second skin. We will find another facility, one that understands how to treat people of quality. We don't need your charity, need quality. I laughed. It was a harsh, ugly sound. You think you're people of quality. You're drifters. You're grifters in cheap suits trying to hustle a retirement home because you squandered your lives. How dare you? Robert slammed his hand on the desk. You don't know us. You don't know a thing about our lives. I know enough, I said, walking slowly back toward the desk. I felt a dangerous energy thrumming under my skin. I know people like you, people who view the world as a buffet table. You take what you want, you leave the mess for others to clean up, and when the bill comes, you run away. We never ran away from anything, Robert shouted. Didn't you? I was standing directly over him now. The air between us was electric. You spent 10 years in Europe, I hissed. While you were drinking wine on the Riviera, did you ever think about what you left behind? Did you ever spare a thought for the obligations you abandoned? Or was it just easier to pretend they didn't exist? Robert's mouth opened and closed. We, we had to live our lives. We raised our daughter. We did our duty. We deserved our time. We did our duty. That was the spark. That was the match in the powder keg. Your duty, I repeated, my voice dropping to a whisper that was louder than a scream. I reached out and grabbed the brass nameplate sitting on the edge of the desk. It was facing outward toward the chairs. Ms. Sanders, Executive Director. I spun it around so the light caught the engraving. Read it, Robert. He frowned, confused by the shift in my tone. He looked at the nameplate. Then he looked at me. He looked at my eyes, the gray-green irises that were a mirror image of his own. He looked at the sharp line of my nose, the same one he saw in the mirror every morning while shaving. I know exactly who you are, I said, my voice trembling with the force of 12 years of suppressed grief. Because you left me on a peeling porch in Tampa in the middle of a thunderstorm. You told me I was heavy baggage, and then you got in your red convertible and you drove away. The silence that followed was absolute. It sucked the air out of the room. Robert's face went slack. The color drained out of him so fast, he looked like a corpse propped up in the chair. Elaine slowly lowered her hands from her face. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, glassy, and terrified. She squinted as if trying to merge the image of the powerful woman in the suit with the memory of the weeping teenager in the rain. Alyssa, she whispered. The name sounded foreign on her tongue. Hello, Mother, I said. Hello, Father. Robert made a sound in his throat, a strangled, choking noise. He gripped the arms of the chair as if the floor had suddenly tilted. Alyssa, you own this place. I do, I said, coldly. I built it. I built it from nothing, from the nothing you left me with. I expected them to be happy. In some dark corner of my mind, I expected them to smile, to try to hug me, to say they were proud. They didn't. They looked horrified. They looked like criminals who had just realized the judge presiding over their trial was the victim of their crime. They shrank back into their chairs, making themselves small. My God, Robert breathed. Alyssa, we didn't know. Obviously, I said. If you had known, you probably would have come sooner, to ask for a loan, to ask for a job, to ask for something. No, Elaine said, shaking her head frantically. No, we wouldn't have. We wouldn't have come. Stop lying, I snapped. You're here, aren't you? You're here begging for a cottage you can't afford. You're here trying to scam me with a fake watch and a story about bonds. I leaned over the desk, invading their space. And that's the irony, isn't it? You spent a fortune. You blew through your savings on villas and cruises. You had a grand old time while I scraped my way through college working double shifts. And now the money is gone and you're at my mercy. I felt a cruel sense of triumph. I hope the wine in Tuscany was worth it, Robert. I hope the sunsets in Nice were beautiful, because they cost you your dignity. And now they're going to cost you a home. Robert looked at me, tears welling in his eyes. But they weren't tears of anger anymore. They were tears of utter defeat. There was no Tuscany, he whispered. I paused. What? There was no Nice, he said, his voice cracking. We went to Italy for 3 months. That was all. We came back in 2015. Don't lie to me, I scoffed. You've been gone for 12 years? We were in Ocala, Elaine choked out. Just 2 hours north. We were in a condo. I frowned. This wasn't the script. They were supposed to be unrepentant jet-setters. Then where is the money if you weren't traveling? Where is the $3 million from the house sale? Where is the retirement fund? Robert put his head in his hands. His shoulders shook. He looked so small, so incredibly fragile. Greg? He wept into his palms. His name was Greg. Who is Greg? I demanded. Elaine spoke up, her voice trembling but gaining strength from desperation. He was a caregiver. 3 years ago, Bob had a stroke, a small one, but he needed help. I couldn't lift him. We hired Greg through an agency. He was so nice. He was so helpful. He drove us to appointments. He helped with the groceries. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for belief. We trusted him, Alyssa. We had no one else. We didn't have family. The word hung in the air like smoke. He started slowly, Robert said, lifting his head. His face was gray. He said he could help with the bills. My eyesight was going. I signed a power of attorney. I thought it was for medical records. It wasn't. He sold the condo, Elaine whispered. He sold it out from under us while we were still living in it. He drained the accounts. Every cent, the savings, the stocks. He even took my jewelry. He cleaned us out, Robert said, his voice hollow. By the time we figured it out, he was gone. The police said, they said it happens all the time. He's in Mexico or maybe Canada. They'll never find him. I stared at them. The anger that had been fueling me for the last hour suddenly had nowhere to go. It swirled in my chest, confused. You're broke, I said slowly. Not because you spent it, but because you were robbed. We have nothing, Robert said. He lifted his wrist, unclasping the fake gold watch. He set it on the desk. It made a cheap, tinny sound. I bought this at a pawn shop so I would look like I still mattered. But I don't. We aren't looking for luxury. Alyssa, Elaine said, tears streaming down her face. We saw the brochure. We saw the security gates, the guards, the cameras. She leaned forward, her hands grasping the edge of my desk. We're scared, she whispered. We're scared all the time. We live in a motel on Route 41. The door doesn't lock properly. Every time someone knocks, we think it's him coming back to finish the job. We didn't come here for the spa. We came here because we just want to be safe. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I had built this entire confrontation in my head. I had prepared to strike down the arrogant, selfish parents who had chosen a life of pleasure over their daughter. I wanted to punish them for their greed. But there was no greed here. There was only fear. They weren't the villains of my story anymore. They were victims. They were two terrified elderly people who had been preyed upon by a monster, just as they had preyed upon my own vulnerability years ago. The irony was sickening. They had abandoned me to find themselves, only to lose everything to a stranger they treated like a son. Robert stood up slowly. He placed a hand on the desk to steady himself. We shouldn't have come, he said quietly. We didn't know it was you. If we had known, we would have died in that motel before we let you see us like this. He turned to Elaine. Come on, Lainey, let's go. Wait, I said. The word was out of my mouth before I could stop it. My brain was screaming at me to let them go. Let them leave. They made their bed. Let them sleep in the motel. It wasn't my problem. I was the director. I was the professional. But I looked at the cheap watch sitting on my polished mahogany desk. It looked so pathetic against the expensive wood. Sit down, I commanded. Robert paused. Alyssa, please, don't humiliate us any further. I said sit down. I didn't know what I was going to do. The anger was gone, replaced by a heavy, aching exhaustion. But as I looked at the two people who had broken my heart, I realized that sending them back into the storm wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't heal the 17-year-old girl on the porch. It would just make me exactly like them. I need to verify your story, I said, my voice shaking slightly. And then we will see. I reached for the phone to call Mrs. Higgins, the head nurse. I needed facts. I needed medical proof. Because if I was going to do what I thought I was going to do, I needed to be sure. I needed to know if they were truly broken or if this was just one final con. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. The receiver clicked into the cradle with a sound that seemed loud enough to crack the glass walls of my office. I didn't look at them. I couldn't. I kept my hand on the phone, staring at the digital clock on the display as the seconds ticked by. 2:47 p.m. The rage that had sustained me for the last 20 minutes, the hot, blinding fire that had driven me to corner them was gone. In its place was a cold, gray confusion. It felt like walking down a staircase in the dark and missing the last step, a jarring, stomach-dropping sensation of disorientation. Across the desk, the silence was agonizing. Robert and Elaine sat frozen like statues constructed of shame and cheap fabric. Robert was staring at his hands, those hands that used to grip a steering wheel with such arrogance, now folded meekly in his lap. He looked withered. The confrontation had stripped away his bluster, and without it, he seemed to have shrunk 3 sizes inside his suit. We can go wait in the car, Robert whispered finally. His voice was brittle, barely audible. If you need time. No, I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. You will wait here. Alyssa, Elaine started, her voice hitching. I know you don't believe us. I know we don't deserve. Quiet, I said. It wasn't a command this time. It was a plea. Just be quiet, please. I needed the silence. I needed to rearrange the furniture in my mind. For 12 years, I had curated a museum of hatred. I had polished every memory of their selfishness until it shone. I knew who they were, monsters, vanity made flesh. But the people sitting in front of me didn't fit the exhibit. Monsters are powerful. Monsters take what they want. These people were trembling because the air conditioning was too high. They were terrified of a knock at the door. They were pathetic. And that was harder to forgive. It is easy to hate a tyrant. It is confusing to hate a victim. A sharp rap at the door broke the spell. Come in, I called out, relieved for the interruption. The door opened and Mrs. Higgins marched in. If Silver Creek was a sanctuary, Martha Higgins was its gatekeeper. She was 62 years old, built like a fortress with steel gray hair, pulled back into a bun so tight it pulled at her eyebrows. She was my head nurse, a woman who had seen everything from death rattles to miraculous recoveries and treated both with the same stoic efficiency. She didn't look at the couple in the chairs. She looked directly at me, her expression grim. Director, she said, clutching a clipboard to her chest, you asked for the intake assessment on the Sanders file. Yes, I said, gesturing to the chair next to Robert. Please, sit. Higgins didn't sit. She preferred to stand. It gave her the tactical advantage. She finally glanced at Robert and Elaine. Her eyes didn't show recognition or judgment. They showed a clinical appraisal, scanning them for defects the way a mechanic scans an engine. I understand there is a question regarding the urgency of admission, Higgins said, her tone professional and flat. There is, I said. They claim to be in immediate danger. They claim neglect. Robert flinched at the word. Elaine looked down at her shoes. Higgins nodded once. She walked to the desk and laid the clipboard down, flipping past the cover sheet. I don't know the financial situation, Director, Higgins said. That's not my department. But I performed the physical preliminary on Mrs. Sanders while Mr. Sanders was filling out the paperwork. And I observed Mr. Sanders' mobility during the walk from the lobby. She tapped a photograph attached to the file. This is Mrs. Sanders' upper arm. I looked. The photo was a close-up of Elaine's pale crepe paper skin. On the bicep, clear as day, were 4 purple-black ovals, finger marks. Someone had grabbed her hard enough to burst the capillaries, hard enough to leave a ghost of a handprint. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. This wasn't the abstract emotional damage I had suffered. This was violence. And this, Higgins continued flipping the page. This is Mr. Sanders' blood work from the rapid panel. He is severely anemic. His protein levels are non-existent. He's dehydrated. She looked at Robert, who was trying to hide his face. When was the last time you had a full meal, Mr. Sanders? She asked, not unkindly but forcefully. Robert swallowed hard. We eat. We buy bread and soup. Canned soup, Higgins corrected. High sodium, low nutrient. You've lost 20 pounds in 6 months, haven't you? Robert didn't answer. He didn't have to. The suit hanging off his shoulders told the story. Director, Higgins said, turning back to me. These aren't the vitals of people who have been vacationing. These are the vitals of people who have been surviving. She lowered her voice, but in the quiet room it carried like a bell. This is classic caregiver exploitation, isolation, malnutrition, physical intimidation to ensure compliance. It's a silent epidemic, ma'am. We see it more often than you'd think. People trust the wrong person, and by the time they realize it, they're too ashamed to call for help. I looked at the photos again. The bruise on Elaine's arm seemed to pulse. Ashamed, I repeated. Yes, Higgins said. They feel stupid. They feel like they brought it on themselves. So they don't call the police. They just endure it until they die. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. If we turn them out, Higgins said, delivering the final blow, they won't last the winter. Mr. Sanders is a stroke risk. Mrs. Sanders is on the verge of a nervous collapse. If they go back to that motel or wherever they've been hiding, they will be dead in 3 months. She closed the file with a snap. That is my medical opinion. Whatever personal history you might have with these applicants, physically, they are at the end of their rope. The room seemed to tilt. I looked at Robert. He was weeping silently now, the tears tracking through the deep lines on his face. He wasn't the man who had abandoned me. That man was gone, eaten alive by time and his own foolishness. The man sitting in front of me was a wreckage. I looked at Elaine. She reached out and took Robert's hand, her fingers tracing the veins on his wrist. It was a gesture of such profound, desperate tenderness that it made my chest ache. They had nothing. They had no money. They had no pride. They had no friends. All they had was each other and the terrifying knowledge that they had been hunted. Mrs. Higgins cleared her throat. Shall I prepare a bed in the infirmary for tonight, Director? Regardless of the contract status, Mr. Sanders needs an IV drip. I stared at the rejection stamp sitting on my desk. It was heavy, made of brass and wood. I could pick it up. I could slam it down on the paper. Denied. It would be justice. It would be the poetic end to the story. The parents who threw their child away are finally thrown away themselves. It was balanced. It was fair. But looking at the bruise on my mother's arm, fair, suddenly felt like a very cold, very empty word. Director, Higgins prompted. Give us a moment, Mrs. Higgins, I whispered. Ma'am, his pressure is... I said, give us a moment. The snap in my voice startled us all. Higgins stiffened, nodded once, and turned on her heel. She marched to the door, pausing with her hand on the latch. "Don't wait too long, Alyssa," she said, dropping the title for the first time in 5 years. "You can't fix the past, but you can decide who dies on your watch." The door clicked shut. We were alone again. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't the silence of judgment. It was the silence of a battlefield after the shooting stops, when you look around and realize that everyone is bleeding and it doesn't matter anymore who started the war. Robert wiped his eyes with his sleeve. He took a deep, shuddering breath and looked at me. His eyes were clear for the first time. "She's right," he said softly. "We are ashamed. We were ashamed to come here. We were ashamed to see you. And we are ashamed of what we did to you." He started to stand up, his knees shaking. "We'll go," he said. "You don't have to say it. I can see it in your face. We'll go." He held out a hand to Elaine. "Come on, Lainey, let's go." I watched them stand. I watched them turn toward the door. I saw the future play out in my head. The cheap motel, the cold soup, the inevitable phone call from a coroner in a few months telling me they had been found. I had the power to destroy them. I had the right to destroy them. But as I watched my father stumble just a little and my mother reach out to steady him, I realized something that terrified me more than their abandonment ever had. I realized that if I let them walk out that door, I wouldn't be teaching them a lesson. I would just be finishing the job that Greg started. "Sit down," I said. They stopped. They didn't turn around. I said, "Sit down." My hand moved to the contract. I picked up my pen. It felt heavy like lead. "We aren't done here." My pen hovered over the contract. It was a Mont Blanc, heavy and black, a gift I had bought for myself when I signed the deed to the property 5 years ago. It was a symbol of my autonomy. With this pen, I signed checks, authorized evictions, and approved renovations. It was the wand that commanded my kingdom. Now it felt like a weapon. I looked at the line items listed on the page. Standard admission fee, $300,000. Monthly assessment, $6,000. I looked at Robert and Elaine. They had obeyed my command to sit, but they were perched on the edge of the leather chairs, like birds ready to take flight at a sudden noise. They were watching the pen, too. To them, it wasn't a symbol of success. It was the executioner's axe. The silence in the room was thick, filled with the ghosts of the last 12 years. I could feel the anger still simmering in my gut, but it was cooling rapidly, turning into a hard, dense slag of resolve. I had every right to use the red stamp. I had every right to call security. I could send them to a state facility. They would be fed. They would be warm. They would be safe enough. It would be justice. It would be the mathematical balancing of the equation: you left me with nothing, so I leave you with nothing. But as I looked at my father's trembling hands, hands that used to look so strong on a steering wheel, I realized that justice is a cold companion. Justice would balance the books, but it wouldn't heal the wound. If I sent them away, I would spend the rest of my life wondering if they were dead. I would carry the weight of their fate just as I had carried the weight of their abandonment. I didn't want to carry them anymore. I wanted to set the baggage down. I realized then that I didn't want to be like them. They had chosen selfishness. They had chosen the easy road of cruelty. If I kicked them out, I would just be continuing the cycle they started. I would be proving that blood means nothing, that family is disposable. I wanted to be better. I pressed the nib of the pen to the paper. The scratching sound was loud in the quiet room. I drew a single thick line through the $300,000 figure. I drew a line through the monthly assessment. Beside the struck-through numbers in my sharp, angular handwriting, I wrote, "Waived, director's discretion." I signed my name at the bottom, Alyssa Sanders, executive director. I capped the pen. The click echoed like a gunshot. "Mr. Henderson," I spoke into the intercom. "Please return to my office." Robert and Elaine flinched. They looked at each other, terror returning to their eyes. They thought I was calling him to escort them out. "Alyssa," Robert whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, we'll go quietly. You don't have to make a scene." "I told you to be quiet," I said, but the venom was gone from my voice. It was just tired now. The door opened and David Henderson stepped in, looking wary. He glanced from me to the weeping couple. "Yes, director." I slid the contract across the desk toward him. "Process this immediately. I want them settled in before dinner." David picked up the paper. He scanned it. His eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. He looked at the waiver, then at me, then back at the paper. "Director," he stammered, This is for Cottage 4, the garden suite." "Is there a problem, David?" "No, ma'am, no problem. It's just complete pro bono for the platinum tier." "Do not question me," I said softly. "Just do it." David swallowed hard. He was a good salesman. He knew when the sale was closed. "Understood. I'll have housekeeping prep the linens." He turned to my parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Sanders, if you'll come with me." They didn't move. They were staring at me, their mouths slightly open. The reality of what I had just done was filtering through the fog of their fear, but they couldn't quite grasp it. It was too big, too impossible. You waived it," Robert asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I did," I said. "But why?" Elaine asked. "After everything," I stood up. I walked around the desk and leaned against the front of it, crossing my arms. I needed them to understand this clearly. "You are going to stay in Cottage 4, I said. "It is the best unit we have. It faces the east garden. It has a full kitchen, though you won't need it, because your meals will be delivered. You will have 24-hour security monitoring. No one gets in or out of this complex without my approval. Greg can never touch you here." Elaine let out a sob, covering her mouth with her hand. "You will be safe," I continued, my voice steady. "You will be fed. You will have clean clothes and medical care. You will never be hungry or afraid again." I paused, locking eyes with my father. "But make no mistake, this is not a reunion. I am not doing this because I am your daughter. I am doing this because I am the director of this facility, and I have the power to help those in need." I took a breath. This was the boundary. This was the wall I had to build to keep my own heart safe. "Do not expect Sunday dinners," I said. "Do not expect us to play happy family. You forfeited that right 12 years ago. You are residents here. I am the administration. That is the deal. Do you accept?" Robert looked at me. For a moment I saw the ghost of the father I had adored, the man who used to carry me on his shoulders. But then I saw the man who had driven away. He nodded, a slow, humble motion. "We accept," he said. Thank you, Alyssa." "Ms. Sanders," I corrected him gently. He lowered his head. "Thank you, Ms. Sanders." "Go with Mr. Henderson," I said. "He'll get you something to eat." They stood up. Elaine hesitated, looking like she wanted to reach out to touch my arm to bridge the gap. I didn't move. I didn't soften my posture. She saw the line I had drawn and she respected it. She nodded, wiping her eyes, and followed David out the door. Robert followed her. But he paused at the threshold. He looked back at me one last time. There was no arrogance left in him, just a profound, crushing gratitude mixed with a sorrow that I knew would last the rest of his life. "You turned out good," he choked out, "despite us." Then he closed the door. I didn't sit back down. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the grounds. The storm had passed. The clouds were breaking apart, leaving jagged streaks of brilliant blue sky. The wet pavement below shone like obsidian. I watched as a white golf cart pulled away from the main building. I saw the back of my father's head, white and frail. I saw my mother leaning into him, her head on his shoulder. They were holding hands. They were safe. I waited for the anger to return, but it didn't. I waited for the bitterness, the sense of unfairness, the screaming voice of the 17-year-old girl who wanted them to suffer. It was silent. Instead, I felt a strange, buoyant lightness. It was as if I had been holding my breath for 12 years, and I had finally exhaled. I realized then that true dignity isn't about status. It isn't about having the corner office or the expensive suit or the power to crush the people who hurt you. True dignity is having the weapon in your hand and choosing not to fire. It is looking at the people who broke you and deciding that you are strong enough to carry them. I had given them the home they never provided for me. I had given them the safety they had denied me. And in doing so, I had proven to them and to myself that I was not the baggage. I was the sanctuary. I watched the golf cart disappear around the bend of the lilac bushes heading toward the finest cottage on the property. I turned back to my desk. I picked up my pen. There was work to do. Whatever ghosts you carry, whatever baggage has been left on your doorstep, remember this. You have the power to decide how the story ends. You can let the bitterness rot you from the inside out, or you can build something beautiful out of the wreckage. Mercy isn't a gift you give to others. It's a gift you give to yourself to set your own heart free. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. Alyssa found peace by breaking the cycle of cruelty rather than perpetuating it. Have you ever faced a similar choice between revenge and mercy with a family member? Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might be the inspiration for our future episodes. We read every single comment. We truly appreciate you being here. There are even more captivating stories waiting for you right on your screen. Please click one now so you don't miss the ending. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. This has been a story from Ashes of Revenge. We'll see you next time.